Washington, D.C., this is Charlie Rose.
We're at the State Department in Washington, D.C. for a special edition of Charlie Rose. It is called Conversations on Diplomacy. We inaugurate the series with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Other former Secretaries of State will follow. It is an opportunity to hear these men and women who have served as Secretary of State talk with Secretary Clinton about today's issues, the philosophical framework for decision-making, our changing world, and new realities. Also to look back at the history of each. What can we learn from their experience? How do they view with 2020 hindsight their actions and their failure to act? Secretary of State is a remarkable position held by a stunning group of Americans, from Thomas Jefferson to George Marshall to Hillary Clinton. Also other familiar names in American history like John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, William Jennings Bryan, Charles Eving Hughes, Dean Acheson, and Ed Muskie, and many more. They have come from an extraordinary diversity of experience, from university professor to chairman of the Joint Chiefs, from politics to law. After the recent death of Warren Christopher, there are 8 living Secretaries of State. There are, of course, Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Madeleine Albright, Lawrence Eagleburger, James Baker, George Shultz, and Henry Kissinger. These conversations are being recorded at the State Department, where room by room you can see America's history and the objects of history, and also a wonderful collection of American paintings and decorative arts. The rooms are named for former Secretaries of State. The John Quincy Adams Room is home to the desk at which the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the American Revolutionary War. The treaty was signed by John Jay, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. These rooms have witnessed historic meetings between American officials and foreign ministers and heads of state. We take note of the 50th anniversary of these rooms and the Patrons of Diplomacy initiative. We begin our conversations on diplomacy with Secretary of State Clinton and former Secretary of State Kissinger. Secretary Clinton came to this office after serving as First Lady of Arkansas and the United States Senator from New York. She was appointed by President Obama after a spirited contest for the Democratic nomination for president. Secretary Kissinger was a Harvard professor, national security advisor of President Nixon, and Secretary of State in the administrations of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. I first want to thank Secretary Clinton for allowing us to come here at the State Department in these historic rooms.
Well, Charlie, we are delighted to have you here for these conversations, and especially in these rooms, which have seen a lot of history and which continue to help us chart our way forward. And I'm especially pleased to welcome back Dr. Kissinger for today's discussion.
How do you see this world that has emerged? What are the factors? What's the opportunity for the United States? Where do we want to go, and how do we want to use our resources?
Well, I think about that question every day because although there is a very clear continuity in American foreign policy that I would argue goes back to the very beginning of our country, every era presents its own challenges and opportunities. And today, in this first part of the 21st century, we clearly continue to spend an extraordinary amount of our time on state-to-state relationships, but we increasingly are focused on networks, on multilateral relationships and organizations, on charting the changes that are sweeping the world, many of them driven by technology, and trying to understand the implications of those changes for the decisions that we make here. There are many more actors who have a role to play and who are demanding that that role be recognized today. And we have to keep up with it. The flood of information that now comes to us, not just from traditional media, but from all of the new forms of media. We're just as likely to see events starting from Twitter feeds as from the statements of heads of state. And therefore, we've had to adjust, and it has been one of my goals as Secretary of State to really look at 21st century statecraft and to recognize the increasing role that people-to-people diplomacy plays in assisting the United States in understanding trends and in influencing decisions. So it's been, I would hesitate to characterize completely, but it's been a very active and challenging period for the last 2+ years.
I somewhere read that you've gone over 512,000 miles.
Oh, but who's counting?
83 countries.
Yes, yes.
Secretary Kissinger, when you were Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, there were two great superpowers, Russia and the United States. Today, people say that there are limits on our power and that the United States has to live in a different world.
Well, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be back here. And it's part of the community of former Secretaries of State who have a non-aggression treaty with each other.
That's right.
Because they know...
A non-aggression treaty.
That's right.
No, they know what the job is like.
Yeah.
And they know how close the decisions are that need to be made. So in all cases, they would have great sympathy for their successors. And in this case, goes back a long time. Now, when I served, we had two great superpowers, and we lived with the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe, which is, from that point of view, less likely today. But even then, there were limits to American power. And the art of foreign policy is to operate at the limit of your power, but not to go beyond it, and to recognize that other countries must feel they're part of the international system, or the tensions become unmanageable. What is unique about this period, I think, is that for the first time in history, there are huge changes going on simultaneously in every part of the world, and that these changes are not of the same nature. In Europe, where the state system originated, the state is losing its significance and they're trying to form a larger unit. In the Middle East, the states never took hold in the same manner and on the same basis, and there is a religious overtone to the contest. In Asia, the states have a character more similar to what the European states used to have. So all I'm saying is that when the Secretary today has to make a decision, she's not talking about the same phenomenon in every part of the world. She has to understand the different cultures, the different histories, and she has to try to bring that into a coherent relationship. And for Americans, who did not until fairly recently have to engage in foreign policy on a regular basis, that is a tough role.
Secretary Clinton, what do you think the world and member states of the world community expect from the United States? What kind of leadership?
I think that the United States remains a dominant power in the world today, the dominant power on many measures. But as Henry said, you know, the art of diplomacy is to balance the power you have with the aims you seek in an attempt to bring as many people with you in a common effort, and to draw lines where one must to protect your interests and your security and advance your values. I think there is a lot of questioning and even some anxiety in the world today, particularly among leaders and among intellectuals, about what it is that we are trying to achieve. Where is America heading? What are our goals? Because we're living in a time of such rapid change, and I think President Obama has rightly captured the the feeling of that, by the embodiment that he represents of that change, and by his very focused effort to reach out to the rest of the world while demonstrating America's continuing influence and power. So what do people expect of us? Sometimes what they publicly say they expect of us is very different than what they privately say they expect of us. We all the time.
Can you explain that? I mean,
well, yes, to some extent. We all the time encounter in relations with other countries a desire for the United States to take a position on an issue that may be of importance to them and even to us. And they think it's very important that we become involved, and usually on their side. But I've also seen those who say publicly we don't want the United States involved, and then privately to us are very much begging us to be involved. So I think there's an uncertainty on a lot of different levels right now about power, about the future of states, about the role of religion, which is increasingly challenging in many parts of the world, about the rise of powers like China and the role that India and Brazil and others will play. So there's a lot of questioning. But it's been my experience in the last 2.5 years that more often than not, people come expecting the United States to be, if not fixing problems, to be part of fixing whatever problems an individual state has or a region has. And one of our biggest foreign policy challenges right now is to get our own house in order. That is something that I feel very strongly about. I know the President does as well, because we have to consolidate our own economic and political position in order to be able to continue to influence events in the future.
As you have said, and the President has said, no country can long maintain, its geopolitical position if its economy is suffering.
That's right. Well, but it's also important to keep the American people feeling very positive about the direction of our own country, because that influences what kind of commitments a government can make. You have to, even in the most authoritarian regimes around the world, people are listening to the opinions of their publics, because those publics now have many more ways of expressing that opinion. And so there's a growing effort to make sure that your views and your actions at home and abroad are aligned with what public opinion is.
The Arab Spring, from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Bahrain, how do you see this? What is the strategic opportunity for the United States? And let's take Libya first.
Whether it's Libya or Tunisia or Egypt or Syria or Yemen, there is an overall arc of actions occurring, some of which are hopeful and some of which are very troubling. And I think Henry can look at that from a broader strategic perspective.
I look at it, Secretary has to make the day-to-day decisions as this crisis develops. From my present posture, I look at it as a historian primarily. And so there are a number of rules that I apply to revolutions. One is you cannot judge the outcome of a revolution by the proclamations of those who make it. Secondly, those who make it rarely survive the process of the revolution. And so that the second wave of the revolution is tremendously important. Third, the greater the upheaval that the revolution causes, the more likely is it that in order to restore order and a sense of legitimacy, that a lot of force gets used. So when one looks at the process, so I look at the process not in terms of what to do tomorrow, because that I couldn't really affect, and I wouldn't really know. But I would make some judgments as to where this is going. And I was on a program with you early, and I warned